I want to quickly talk actually about the United Nations and something that you might hear in my speech. The key word of China is used a lot, but for our organization and me personally, I usually say the Chinese Communist Party, which is what they refer to themselves as. And there's a distinct difference between China, the Chinese people, and the party. The party is not representative of the people. No one elected them. And on the United Nations part, I went to Geneva a few years ago to attend a peace summit. And in the main hall of the United Nations headquarters, there was a huge sign, probably half the size of a football field, and it said, China is celebrating 70 years of human rights in every single language. And that week there were dignitaries from 190 plus countries going, and this is the first thing they're seeing on their way to the peace summit. And I just thought it was ridiculous. So that kind of formed my career really, and why I want to get into this work specifically. There are 6 main methods that the Chinese Communist Party uses to target religious, they call it dissenters, prisoners of conscience. And we're going to use the case study of Falun Gong today to really illustrate how it goes down. This is Falun Gong. It's a mind-body cultivation that the Chinese regime is deathly afraid of. It's rooted in the Buddhist tradition, went viral in China, and it's basically a slow-moving meditation with a moral philosophy centered on 3 tenets: truth, compassion, and forbearance. And Falun Gong's encouragement of independent thought, belief in the creator, all of these moral principles spooked the atheist party leaders. And we have documents of the directives that the president of that time sent out. He said he wanted to eradicate all of these people within 3 months. Yet Falun Gong has survived in China and even spread to millions of people in 108 countries, being translated in over 50 languages. So the first method is mass detentions and harsh sentences. Falun Gong practitioners are systematically arrested, detained, sentenced to lengthy prison terms of up to 20 plus years for their faith. And this is across every province in China. Provinces in the northeast, close to Beijing, are targeted more heavily just because there's higher population density. So last year, at least 2,864 practitioners were documented to have been harassed by police, either in their own homes or in public. There were 2,828 that were arbitrarily detained. You have sentences, 595 were documented to have been sentenced up to 13 years for either having private, what they call Bible study, I guess is the equivalent, or for passing out flyers. And there were 114 documented deaths. Now I do want to have a caveat here. This is only what is able to escape censorship in China. So in the past 25 years, millions, according to US State Department, according to different human rights organizations, Amnesty, millions have been harassed, millions have been arbitrarily detained, over 100,000 sentenced, and over 5,178 deaths. This is 62-year-old Zhou Deyou, the husband and father of Florida residents. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison and fined approximately 14 grand US dollars for having Falun Gong books in his private home. After a sham trial, this man, a senior geological engineer, he was sentenced and barred from communication with his family and his lawyer. He hasn't seen his wife or son in over 4 years, and he is reportedly being tortured, and he can't eat because his teeth were beaten out of his mouth. From Jilin province, also in the northeast, as you can see, this is Miss Du Hongfang. She's a mother, and she became paralyzed following torture at labor camps and prison. She was sentenced to more than 8 years recently for appealing for religious freedom in Beijing. She went to Beijing, she went to the central government, and she appealed for religious freedom in China. During her sentence, the guards used electric batons to beat her, forced her to do slave labor for 14 hours a day. Her husband was sentenced 14 years, leaving their 9-year-old son alone at home. And her son was actually expelled from school at 9 years old because of his faith. In 2022, Human Rights Without Frontiers reported 79% of all religious prisoners whose cases they had documented in China were Falun Gong practitioners. So, as you can see, the detention process is often brutal, with practitioners enduring violence and psychological abuse aimed at forcing them to renounce their faith. That's the end game. The second method is digital surveillance and high-tech repression. China's advanced surveillance network, as some of you might know already, is bolstered by AI, which plays a crucial role in tracking and arresting Falun Gong practitioners across the country. Surveillance research firm IPVM in Europe discovered alarms in Chinese smart policing software by Hikvision, which you might recognize because it's a surveillance camera you can buy on Amazon, Hikvision, that alerts security forces of Falun Gong practitioners and other religious believers in a given area in China. Low-tech methods such as neighborhood informants now work in tandem with facial recognition cameras and mass data collection to identify practitioners and their activities. It's important to note that the CCP intensifies surveillance during what they call politically sensitive periods, like the Beijing Olympics, for example, or what they call the 2 sessions, where the CCP's central leadership gather in Beijing for a week of discussion. Thus, practitioners who remain outside of detention and go about their daily lives will face persistent monitoring during these times. So between January 2022, which is when Winter Olympics began, and April 2024, we found at least 7,147 practitioners were subject to home visits, warrantless searches, and financial extortion. In February 2023, authorities in Changchun City tracked 17 Falun Gong practitioners using surveillance footage, and they were later sentenced to prison terms of up to 4 years for handing out flyers, and those were caught on CCTV. Mobile phone tracking applications have also been deployed, allowing authorities to monitor internet activity, phone conversations on WeChat, for example, and movement patterns. Even encrypted messaging platforms have been infiltrated, leading to arrests of practitioners who attempt to communicate safely. The third method is deaths, killing. The CCP's brutal tactics have resulted in thousands of documented deaths. However, what's not told is how victims frequently die in custody from torture, abuse, or even forced organ harvesting. Pang Xun was a 30-year-old radio host. He had a really popular program in Sichuan. He was arrested for distributing flyers in a park. Within 4 months of his detention, he was tortured to death in 2023, and graphic footage of his injuries went viral on X after his friend blew the whistle. And this is graphic, but I felt like it was important to show the video that his friend posted.
你这个太造诣了嘞，你看着。
太造诣了，这妈妈爸爸不在你身边就这样受欺负啊！这是共产党的天下呀！我胖勋呐，胖勋嘞，爸爸妈妈啊，
哎，看中央，看这党员是
怎么教育他们历史的？
太残忍了。
那你们都看到了，个个都看到了。
你们都看到了。
你们只有有点良心的，你们也是走父母的，也是走儿子的。
有在意，晓得吧？有在意还是以后的。
His aunt is saying, they beat my nephew. They beat my nephew to death. That's what she keeps saying. And she keeps yelling at him because she doesn't believe that he's dead. And so she's trying to wake him up, basically. But he has in fact passed. That's actually one of the few footage that has actually made it outside of China due to VPNs, due to the younger generation of Chinese people being able to access X, Facebook, different social media platforms. And in another case that's very personal for myself, one of my friends, Simon Zhang, he's an architect in New York. His mother was actually arrested around the Beijing Winter Olympics. And she was arrested 3 days before the Olympics. They wanted to silence her because she did a lot of advocacy in Beijing. She had like terabytes of footage of documentaries and different flyers and pamphlets that she's collected over the years to be able to share with friends and family on WeChat and different things. Simon actually went around Congress and she advocated for her release, which gained support from senators like Rick Scott. But like during his advocacy, he learned that his mother had actually passed away. So the impunity with which the CCP operates allows these deaths to continue even in this year, despite widespread condemnation from Chinese lawyers, international human rights groups, and policymakers. So Simon here actually spoke at the Hudson Institute last year, and he revealed that his surviving family members in China have been sent photos of him at parades, at roundtables in Congress, and at different events. And they were threatened, even to this day. Him speaking out about his mother's death is a really big issue for the Chinese Communist Party. The fourth method, torture and forced labor. Falun Gong practitioners endure extreme torture. Common methods include electric shocks, force feeding, sleep deprivation, beatings, and sexual violence. And then this is a math teacher who was killed. He was tortured into a coma, released. While he was in a coma, the court sentenced him to 2.5 years. And he didn't obviously go to prison because he can't go to prison, he's in a coma. And he died soon after he was sentenced. Survivors have also testified to being confined in small cages, denied medical care, and subjected to psychological brainwashing campaigns. And the CCP's goal is to break their will and get them to renounce their faith. And those who refuse often face prolonged abuse or sent to additional brainwashing. And those who are coerced into agreeing are then used as Chinese agents to re-educate their former friends. So the fifth method is forced organ harvesting, and this perhaps might be the most horrifying aspect. Multiple independent investigations, including those conducted by the China Tribunal in London and researchers from the US and Canada, have found that prisoners of conscience in China are killed for their organs. This is the only known survivor of a Falun Gong practitioner who went to Congress last year and confessed that he survived organ harvesting. Part of his lung and part of his liver were taken without his consent, and he escaped. Recently came to the US thanks to policymakers who secured his safe travel. He's not alone. Forced organ harvesting has been committed for years throughout China on a significant scale. And Falun Gong practitioners have been one and probably the main source of organ supply. And a lot of people ask why, but if you look at the teachings of Falun Gong, in Buddhism, traditionally, we don't drink, we don't smoke, we don't do drugs. And it's about having a pure body. And so China has basically killed two birds with one stone. They have millions of people in detention with healthy bodies, healthy organs, and they have a booming system and a world full of people who are on the organ waitlist. China's transplant industry boasts suspiciously short wait times, as little as 2 weeks for certain organs, suggesting a vast on-demand supply or organ bank. And in June 2021, UN independent experts also expressed concerns that prisoners of conscience are forcibly subjected to blood tests and organ examinations, such as ultrasound and x-rays, while other prisoners are not required to undergo such examinations. The results of the examinations are reportedly registered in a database of living organ sources that facilitates organ allocation. Transnational repression and malign influence operations. This is the only part of my presentation that I'm not focusing on inside China. Overseas practitioners have been harassed, physically assaulted, and subjected to surveillance. If you guys remember Joe's family in Florida, due to their tireless government advocacy, former Senator Marco Rubio, and now Secretary of State, and over a dozen Florida federal and state officials wrote letters directly to Xi Jinping and State Department to request the immediate release of Joe. Despite this, online pro-Beijing commentators have responded with hate directed towards his wife and son in America. They are also concerned that Chinese-linked actors, such as consulates, are monitoring them when they are joining think tank panels and they are speaking out at congressional events. Reports have also surfaced of covert Chinese police stations operating in New York and overseas, tasked with intimidating and silencing dissidents. This was a photo taken in Argentina that our organization was able to get our hands on, and members of local Chinese associations attacked Argentinian practitioners because they were holding banners that said "Stop the persecution of Falun Gong" during a Xi Jinping car parade. Over the past year, we have documented over 60 death threats and other violent threats targeting Falun Gong practitioners and affiliated organizations. According to internal party sources, in 2022, Xi Jinping complained that efforts to silence Falun Gong to date have not yet been creative enough, and called on the regime's security and secret police apparatus, or Gestapo, to intensify efforts, including through the use of sophisticated disinformation and lawfare tactics in the US and abroad. The result has been a new and reinvigorated campaign to smear the reputation of believers in America, including Shenyun Performing Arts, a classical Chinese dance company founded by Falun Gong practitioners who sought refuge in America. According to leaked documents, the regimes and its proxies are mobilizing social media influencers against this dance company, and they're trying to manipulate foreign media into spreading their narratives. Their goal is to prompt the US government and its agencies to launch investigations, all with the aim of dealing a final blow to Falun Gong in the US. In September 2024, this one's a really ridiculous story, but in September 2024, a court in California sentenced 2 Chinese agents, one who was pictured, to prison after they attempted to bribe an IRS official into revoking the non-profit status of Shenyun. These agents went up to the IRS official, promised them tens of thousands of dollars, but it was an undercover FBI cop. So they were caught. As the regime and pro-Beijing actors drive forward this campaign, their targets have expanded beyond Falun Gong. One threat was sent starting February 8th, after the US State Department publicly condemned these threats. The subject line says the US State Department would be the first target, and then the message reads, if the US State Department dares to support Falun Gong, it is possible that it would drive a car loaded with bombs, ram the main entrance of the State Department, and then detonate the bomb. The persecution of Falun Gong is one of the most egregious human rights crises of our time, and I truly do believe that. For 25, almost 26 years now, this July, the CCP has sought to eradicate Falun Gong completely through imprisonment, torture, forced labor, digital surveillance, and even transnational repression. Yet practitioners have demonstrated extraordinary resilience in the face of unimaginable brutality. But as the above examples demonstrate, of the death threats, of the violence, the victims of the persecution are not only Falun Gong. This is an incubator. For over 2 decades, the regime's campaign has just evolved into more and more sophisticated repression tactics, which have then been applied to other targets. The very same officials, for example, inside China, who brutally persecuted Falun Gong in the early 2000s, have been promoted to positions in Tibet and West China, Xinjiang, leading to repression against those religious and ethnic minorities in those regions. Outside China, the tactics of transnational repression and foreign influence are being deployed against our own institutions to malign and silence religious believers, which compromise our national security and even our democracy. These dynamics illustrate the extent to which the campaign to eliminate Falun Gong is not only an example of religious persecution on the other side of the world. Rather, it also holds our freedom of expression, privacy, and other values hostage.